In the meantime, I will just quickly get started with some brief housekeeping items. So my name is Claire Ladd. I'm the Programs and Services Manager at the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network. So thank you so much for joining us today. Just a few items before we get started. We will be sending out the recording from today's program after the webinar. We will not be sharing the slides at the presenter's request, but we will be sharing the recording. And we will also send over a survey after the webinar so that you can provide some feedback. If you have any technical difficulties, you can let us know via the chat and we can help you with that. And you can also use the chat to submit questions for the presenter. For a little background about us here at MNN, our three goals at MNN are to strengthen the nonprofit sector through advocacy, public awareness, and capacity building services. So as part of our capacity building offerings, we have this webinar series. Feel free to reach out to us if there's any topics you'd like to see, and stay tuned for future topics. So our efforts are made possible by more than 600 member organizations. If you're not yet a member, we'd love to have you join to take advantage of our offerings. So visit massnonprofitnet.org/join to find out more. All right, so for today's webinar, Public Policy 101 is presented by Liz Peck. Liz is with Elizabeth Peck Policy Strategies, a woman business enterprise that offers public policy expertise to nonprofits, governmental agencies, and philanthropic entities. For 20 years, Liz has applied her deep commitment to promoting equity and racial justice in the field of public policy. Prior to launching Peck Policy Strategies, Liz served in public policy director and executive leadership roles within the nonprofit sector in Massachusetts. This included 15 years lobbying Beacon Hill, mobilizing folks on the ground, and leveraging data toward policy and practice change. She started her career in research, and her areas of content expertise include health, housing instability, and young families. Liz believes that policy advocacy is a powerful means towards dismantling structural systems of oppression when the voices of folks most directly impacted and harmed by systems are centered. So now I'll hand it over to Liz to get started.
Good morning, everyone. It is so wonderful to be with you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to join. If you haven't already, I welcome you to put your name and title and agency in the chat. You can also put one word to describe how you're feeling at the moment, just how you're showing up today. It can help to sort of name that, to bring yourself to be present to the extent that you're able in this moment in this moment and over the next hour, and feel like you can show up how you are. You know, we do a lot of Zoom meetings and it can look different depending on where you're trying to connect from. I love seeing your faces and having you on camera, and I also understand that sometimes that to take best care of yourself, you need to be off camera for a variety of reasons. So I just welcome you to be as present as you're able today. There'll be lots of opportunities, I hope, throughout to have some interaction, but through a lot of different means. So for today, the goal is there. I'll let you read that for a moment. And I will also read it quickly myself. Increase your understanding of what effective public policy is, the Massachusetts state budget process, and how to affect change through public policy advocacy. As Claire said, it's really an intro 101. I do, a variety of versions of this training. This is the shortest version that I do, and there's others where there's space to dig in and do more, but there'll also be lots of opportunities to get an introduction to all of these concepts today. So beginning with a little activity that you'll need your raise hand function for. So I think most people can find that quickly on Zoom by now. It might be, if you click on more, you'll find it, find your reactions where you click on more, or it can be next to your share screen. So I want you to raise your hand. And if you can't find the raise hand function, you can just raise your physical hand. If you're on camera, that's fine too. But have you ever, and then raise your hand if the statement is true, have you ever asked for a raise Giving folks a minute. Okay. Have you ever asked for a discount on an item or a service? I grew up with a mom who was always bargain hunting, so I definitely pick this one up and do it all the time, or at least I'm thinking it, and then I have to say, is this appropriate in this scenario to ask for a discount? Okay, how about push to school to provide a different kind of support for either your own child or a loved one, or it might even be, you know, like a program participant that you work with. How about works to create an internal change at your agency that impacted how your agency functions? And then lastly, try to persuade a friend or family member to take your advice. I think most people have done the last one for sure. And I saw many hands go up for a lot of these, or stay up. So each and every one of these is advocacy, is a form of advocacy. And it's something that you already know how to do. It really is intuitive and something that every one of us does in different ways, and if not your daily life, at different points in your life, in your career, you know what advocacy is. Public policy advocacy is what we're going to dig into a little bit more today. So on a super basic level, advocacy is taking action in support of a cause or a proposal, right? Taking action through public policy advocacy to persuade others to support a cause that impacts a law, policy, or procedure, right? So on a super basic level, that's what it is. And you can find more technical terms, you know, like a strategy to affect policy change or action is another way to talk about policy advocacy. Sometimes you hear a structured and sequenced plan of action with a purpose to start, direct, or prevent a specific policy. But if there's anything else you take away from today, I really want you to understand that advocacy is something you know already, and public policy advocacy is this taking action to persuade others to support a cause and create a shift in some sort of policy or practice. So a couple more definitions, and I'm actually going to pause to see if there's any questions about these common definitions. One is legislature up here, not to be confused with legislator. And a lot of people, even folks who have been doing public policy work themselves for a while, will sometimes use incorrect language here across these, which is why I highlight them. So the legislature, right, is the body, is the legislative body. It's senators and representatives combined. And you say the Massachusetts legislature, you know, passes bills, you know, the Massachusetts legislature is working on a new economic development bill, right? And then legislator, which is down below, is one person who makes laws, a member of the legislature or a member of the legislative body. So you might say the legislator from New Bedford was up for re-election. And legislators refer to both reps and senators. And in Massachusetts, we have 140 representatives in the House of Representatives and 40 senators in the Senate. Now, in a minute, I'm going to walk through this last definition, but I am going to ask you, those of you who would like to try putting a sentence together in the chat with one of these words, one of these vocab words. Put a sentence together and pop it in the chat if any of you want to give that a try. While you're working on your sentences, representatives. So I sometimes hear folks use this term really broadly. Like sometimes they say, oh, I'm talking to my representative. Well, if it's your representative you're talking to who's actually your senator, that's kind of confusing for folks in the State House really doing policy work. Because representative really means, you know, in the policy world, one of the people from the House of Representatives. So just a couple things to hone into rather. If it's your representative you're talking about, say that specifically versus senator. I'm seeing if there's anybody who is brave enough to put a sentence in the chat. You can work on it. It's okay if it takes you a couple minutes. And I also want to invite any questions at this point. I know we've just covered a couple things, but feel free to ask in the chat, or you can feel welcome to unmute if you have any questions about any of these definitions. Okay, I'm going to keep moving along. So quickly, levels of advocacy. There's 3 basic levels of advocacy. The local level is when you're looking to influence change, right, at the city or town level. And then there's state and federal. But I want to pause for a minute at the state level because there's a couple different ways to influence public policy at the state level. Most people are very familiar with, you can pass a bill, you can pass legislation. You can also work on the state budget. Tons of programs, right, get funding through the state budget. And in the state budget, where they decide how much different programs get, there's also a lot of language around rules attached to those programs. So a lot of people do advocacy around the state budget. And then there's administrative advocacy at the state level. So you think of anybody that falls underneath the governor's administration, right? Whether that's Department of Public Health, or Department of Transitional Assistance, or Housing Community Development, any one of those state agencies and the secretariats that they belong to, the entire governor's realm. When you're working to influence the decision-making that they're doing, that's administrative advocacy, and a lot of work happens there. Maybe some of you have done that informally yourselves. Anytime you're talking to a staff person from any one of those agencies, and you're trying to get them to do something that you want them to do on behalf of your cause, that's policy advocacy. And then there's effective advocacy. So we talked about some basic definitions, levels of advocacy, but what is really effective advocacy? So I was a fan of what former Boston City Councilor Ayanna Pressley, and had the privilege of working with her on a lot of issues when she was more local, and now Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who said people closest to the pain must be closest to the power, driving and informing policymaking. And so I have a deep held belief, but also have seen this in my 20 years of doing public policy work, that when policy is shaped, informed by, to the extent possible led by folks who have been most directly impacted and harmed by public policy, when they're involved in that way, that's when we achieve effective policy. And if I were to take an example, if you're working on addressing family homelessness, which I have in previous roles of mine, that means involving folks who are experiencing or have experienced homelessness, and identifying what the problems are and helping to advocate to change those. And it's also talking to a lot of you all in the room, service providers who are running programs across the state, helping to get the work done and serve and work in partnership with folks directly impacted. It's you all who understand how to navigate the system. So it's working with people who are on the ground to create effective change. And also looking for where systemic inequities exist. And so there's a framework I like to use to help frame effective policy advocacy. And it's the socio-ecological model. This comes out of public health. There's lots of ways that people will talk about how to get to root causes of policy, of, the root causes of any societal issues, quite frankly. And so effective public policy advocacy understands that individual outcomes, right, or what happens in the lives of individual people is heavily impacted by all of these layers of the model, right? And it's only in this grounding can we really effectively target our advocacy on the root causes of why folks are facing whatever challenges there are, another way to put that, why we are seeing negative outcomes at the individual level, why we're seeing inequitable, or rather why we're seeing disparities at the individual level. So just to give an example of what this can look like in this model at the individual, relationship, community, and societal level, one of the other areas I used to work in was adolescent reproductive and sexual health. So as an example, at the individual level, you might look at things like personal health conditions or issues, whether the choice to use contraceptives or not, level of education. At the relationship level, you might look at things like our experience or past trauma with domestic violence or sexual abuse, whether there's mentors in the person's life and trusted relationships. Parent-child communication has been highly connected to outcomes for adolescents in this area. Examples at the community level, things like, is there comprehensive sexual health education in schools or research-based education happening in schools for young people? Is there access to community or school-based health clinics, funding, availability of contraception, right? And then at the societal level, and this is a lot of sometimes the invisible pieces that if we're not naming them, we forget are part of what's driving root cause, where things like cultural norms come into play. And yes, federal level public policy and state level public policy too, that shapes many things. And also, norms promoted by the media, societal stigmas, all of this comes into play and is also where some, without any individual action, although individual actions matter, but where things like, wealth gaps can be perpetuated and different kinds of oppression like racism can exist through cultural norms, through the media. So I'm just understanding that this is the larger picture within which we're doing public policy work, can shift how we approach it. Just pausing to see if any questions have come in through the chat. It doesn't look like it. So then getting to how we advocate, really breaking it down, it's 3 steps when we really distill it: getting the right information, the right people at the right time. And we're going to walk through an example of what this can look like to give you a chance to brainstorm some of what even creating effective messaging might look like. So before I dig too much deeper, let me lay out the example that I'm going to use. I mentioned that I've worked around addressing family homelessness before. This is a picture in the background. This is the State House. I used to work at Homes for Families, and they host a cookie day every year for many years before the pandemic, especially. It was very large at the State House, and in partnership also, I want to shout out CHAPA and many other partners who made Cookie Day possible year over year. But what the focus of the Advocacy Day is around is the Massachusetts rental voucher program. Some of you might be familiar with it, but it's a state-funded housing voucher, so you can afford housing, and it gets funded through the state budget. So totally separate from federal level like Section 8 vouchers that people sometimes are more familiar with. So this was a really effective campaign that saw, because of it, there was major increases in investments years past in MRVP for short. And I'm going to use it as an example to help us think through a little bit of what the right information might be. So if you're advocating around, okay, we need policymakers to invest more money for affordable housing, to invest more money into this rental voucher program, what are some pieces you might need to think about if you're trying to come up with what the right information is to share to be persuasive, right? What kind of messaging, basic information you might think about pulling together. I invite you to put that in the chat, to unmute. And it doesn't mean you have to craft like the perfect messaging statement. It's more like buckets of info. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. And the positive impact for societal benefit. Absolutely. Impact and outcomes of current policy versus anticipated change. Yes, yes, yes. You're starting to speak to, I mean, that weaves into a lot of pieces of the right information. But one of them is data. It's data around impact, around societal benefit, comparing current policy over anticipated change. And one thing to think about when you're providing data and statistics, right? Yes, 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 definitely getting to that, Joy, identifying the problem, putting human face on who was harmed, definitely. One thing to think about when you're putting together the right information, and there's other pieces that we'll highlight in a moment, is sometimes you're working with some people, some policymakers who you feel like they get it and they have the data, but you want to be able to give them this kind of data on paper, in hard copy or whatever, you know what I mean? You want to be able to give it to them for them to have for talking points to advocate with other people. So really knowing that you're not just messaging to one person in front of you, but thinking about how to convey it to many others who might be harder to convince. And yeah, demonstrating also the return on investment when you put money into things like affordable housing, then what you get in return. Another important piece is stories, which is what you were pointing to, Joy. You know, every time that we can connect to the humanity of the people behind the numbers, I start with the numbers, because the numbers matter. And they only matter because humans are attached to them, right? So thinking on multiple levels on how to bring people who are directly impacted, their stories to life, but in a meaningful way, in a way that's also connected, hopefully, to those folks who are most directly impacted, being part of shaping what the advocacy is focused on. I'm involving them in multiple ways, including for the opportunity to share their story in ways that are supported. And another way of doing this is messaging that removes stigma and prejudice. So thinking about how we're framing our right information. Are we framing it in a way that talks about the collective responsibility we have together and the collective impact of when we do invest in things like housing versus a very individual focused lens, going back to that socio-ecological model. Just for a very specific example, even thinking of how we use words can make a difference, and the neurological connections, this is brain science, that people make when they hear certain words or things. Thinking of how we frame, are we talking about poor families? Are we talking about homeless families? Or we're talking about families or children who are experiencing homelessness? Families who are of lower income. That's a really simple example, but there's ways that I've worked on over the years where we get to think very critically about what are the words we're choosing, how are we framing what our ask is, so that it continues to put the humanity piece first, and continues to place within a root cause perspective of what are the systems factors in the lives of people. That's the thoughtful framing piece. families in under-resourced communities. Yeah, I like it a lot. Thank you, Joy. The other piece is unified message. So this is part of why the MRVP campaign got a lot more investment through the state budget year over year, because there was a lot of people with the same message. It's really kind of rare to see massive advocacy days at the State House that are focused on one program. It's usually like affordable housing and please invest in these 5 ways, right? Because all 5 ways or 10 ways will make a difference. But somehow, and I was not a part of the brilliance behind this, it was other people who came before me. It's something I pushed for, but it's so hard to get people to come together and say, we're gonna get a lot of people to ask for just funding for MRVP, and we're all gonna ask for the same amount, and that is gonna be the headline that everybody sees. So some examples of this right information. This was a chart that was used year over year. We would update it. So you could see where when MRVP, the green, where investment in MRVP went up, the number of families, so EA caseload is families experiencing homelessness, the number of families in shelter went down. And I know this is for folks who are quantitative minded. I know this is correlational. It's not causation, right? We didn't do like a funded empirical study, and that's okay, as long as it's clear and honest of what the data is. But it helped to make a very compelling case for other people who still maybe needed to be convinced by what happens when you invest in housing. Then we don't have to spend as much on shelter, which unfortunately is where a lot of the focus ends up being, is the spending. And politically, no one wants to have high numbers of families in shelter. Now we're starting to use the motel system again. No politician wants to have that on their watch. And unfortunately, that's the less human focused part of this, is just like the numbers of it. Politicians very much so care about the human people behind it too. I absolutely don't mean to dismiss that. However, from a political standpoint, that is another factor at play, if we're being honest and savvy. And then an example of personal stories. This is someone who experienced homelessness, who spoke at a cookie day, who shared their story through a speech. There's lots of ways to do that. But this is one example that also conveys how it was placed within, larger systems frame. And then this was something that, again, wasn't my original idea, but I thought was brilliant. Every year as part of Cookie Day, it was called Cookie Day because they came up with this cookie idea. They got these cookies made with the ask. The number right here says 120 M, MRVP 120 million. And they gave a cookie to every single legislative office, which is just an example again of that very consistent message. And then being creative about that unified message. You get a lot of people at the State House bringing a cookie that says 120 million, wearing a sticker that says 120 million. There's other super grassroots organizations like Vida Life Urbana and others like the Fight for 15, who will come to the State House and wear the same colored t-shirt. So this kind of unified messaging from a visual standpoint becomes recognizable year over year also. So the presence then, if you have a staffer from a legislative office, all they need to do is catch the visual and they go, oh, those folks are back again. It's like a reminder. And that's also part of why that campaign was so successful. It's the visuals start to do some of the work for you. Any questions that have come up?
I just think there's something also so kind of symbolic about offering a cookie. There's just something warm and giving and community oriented about it. So I think it's impactful in that way too.
Thank you for that. It was actually kids who came up with the idea. I think it was like they accidentally scheduled one of the first cookie days over school break. And so they're like, what do we do? And if we're bringing the kids, what are we going to have for the kids? And they landed on cookies. And it becomes, yeah, recognizable. It's also, you know, it's not to say that you don't want to break out of the mold and surprise decision makers with something they're not expecting, but maybe coupled with something that, again, like I said, there's something about it begins to do the work for you when there's a visual that they tie to your ask, when they know, okay, they're talking about MRVP. So then 2 more pieces to right. There's right info. There's also right people, right time. So with the right people, you really, when you're looking for what do you want to change, in this case, right, we're talking about affordable housing. You got to figure out who those ultimate decision makers are, right? And I do, you know, like a whole other training talking about like how to determine like who the influencers are. But if it's MRVP, you got to figure out, okay, who are the chairs of the housing committee and the legislature, right? At the end of the day, nothing moves unless leadership wants it to. Sadly, it is not democratic. The president of the Senate, if it's something's moving through the Senate side, or for the budget, we're talking about investing in MRVP in the state budget, then it matters on the Senate and representative side. Senate president has to be okay with it, the Speaker of the House, and then they will defer to some extent and speak to the chairs of housing and the chairs of the money committee, which is Ways and Means. And those are the top players. Sometimes there'll be a couple other people in leadership involved in the more inner circle making these final decisions. And then hopefully you have folks over at the Department of Housing and Community Development on your side, being willing to distribute the dollars, because sometimes they get money and then the vouchers don't go out, and there's a whole lot of complicated reasons why things like that happen. So the administration of money, of policy that happens through the, I keep wanting to say the Baker administration, but it's not anymore, you know, through the governor's state agencies matter. So you have to figure out who you need to work with in the relevant secretariat and state agencies. I'll mention, because I have here administration and finance, that's the kind of like the money committees of the legislature are the Ways and Means committees. The money department and the governor's administration is administration and finance. So everybody has their sort of money committee. And then you got to think about who can help you influence those ultimate decision makers, right? How do you get to them? It's not just you or your organization who has to do all the work. You need to partner. Do not overlook the staff that are lower down at state agencies, and definitely don't overlook the legislative aides and staff offices. They are your best friends. They are internal advocates. Both staff at state agencies and the legislative aides are internal advocates. And they can help. A lot of the time in Massachusetts, there's so many legislators that ideologically support so many amazing causes, and it really comes down to, well, it's multiple things, but one thing it comes down to is just if that priority is high enough. Just like, is it number 4? They're not going to get to it. They care about it, but it's like keeping it number 1. It's like how to get it number 1. And the aides certainly can help with that. And same thing with legislators not in positions of leadership. It's not like they don't matter. They do, just it's sort of where the buck stops, is the ultimate decision makers. But everybody does matter and can play a different role at different stages of the process. And then others, obviously you want to be thinking of, again, people with lived experience on the ground, and how to build that base of other partners you can work with. Any major policy shift requires just lots and lots of people coming together, right, with that unified message, and a range of other stakeholders. Of course, I mentioned again, the larger power structures at play, which are always finding their ways into this. Even if you think about who makes up the ultimate decision makers, it's mostly white men. And just being honest about that, that's a different kind of lived experience. When you have more voices around the table, when we start to have more women and more people of color, for example, more LGBTQ identified folks, it just allows for richer perspective of how the world functions, what might need to change, how we come together to make things better for everyone. But actually I heard former Senator Chang Diaz say this recently, you know, the way that the State House functions and sort of policy structures, it lags behind the rest of society. So where you might see more progress in some places, it might take longer to see folks filling those positions of leadership in a way that is truly reflective of the people. And then finally, the right time. So I want you to think about, as you look at this, where you think is the right time to influence the state budget process. So in the fall, this is where state agencies, the governor's administration and finance office, they start to put together what they want their budget proposal to look like for the year. The budget process happens every year. Unlike it's a 2-year process for trying to get legislation to pass. This one piece of legislation, the state budget is a bill, it's a piece of legislation, but it has to happen, and it happens every year. So in the fall is when the governor's people start to come up with what his proposed budget's going to be. That's released usually in January. It's called either House 1 or House 2. It gets released later in years when we elect a new governor. That comes out. And then completely separate budget comes out in April, usually like the 3rd week, from the House. So the overview is the governor releases a proposed budget, the House releases a proposed budget, the Senate releases a proposed budget, and then the House and Senate have to come together in June to come up with a compromise, which they call conference committee. They have to work out their differences between that House budget and the Senate budget. And then that conference committee budget is what is sent to the governor. It's supposed to happen by July. It really rarely happens on time. And that's when you'll hear, like, you might hear in the news, like the governor signed the new state budget. And it's never really final. There can be, you know, the governor will sign it, but with vetoes, right? Like they'll sign it, it will become law, but he'll like reduce the amount that's going to MRVP, for example. And then if the legislature is not cool with that, with 4/5 majority, they can override that veto. And then in an ongoing way, there can be this supplemental spending. Sometimes you hear people say a sup budget, a mid-year spending package. There's other opportunities in an ongoing way. Inevitably, there's always supplemental spending budgets, and you can wait to try to get your piece in through a sup budget that adds to, you know, what was signed by the governor. And what I don't have a ton of time to get into like the nitty gritty about is, you know, all that happens when the House is coming up with their budget, how that happens. And there's a lot of sort of pieces within there that's part of a longer training, but what I do want you to at least walk away with is the understanding that there is a bunch of proposed budgets before a final is signed. And your guess, and you can pop it in the chat if you want, your guess of like when it's a good time to advocate for something in the state budget. And while you're thinking about that, I am going to say that the FY fiscal year 2022 state budget was about $48 billion. And so when you hear people say there's not enough money for like meeting people's basic needs, there is lots of money. It goes a lot of important places, a lot of it to healthcare and other kinds of, it's called entitlement spending that we have to take care of as a state, but there's a lot of money. And we do need more, and it's a great idea to always find some revenue to advocate for too. If you have an ask for spending, see if there's a campaign that you or your organization believes in where you're like, okay, I also believe Oh, it's escaping me what we just recently got passed, right? The different taxing structure for people with much higher incomes in Massachusetts. I don't know why it's escaping me what that was called. But that's, an example of revenue advocacy. There's campaigns going on for that too. And the other piece of this is, and then I'll circle back to the right time and your guesses on when to advocate, is you can raise your hand for real if you want, but you don't have to if you feel on the spot. Do you feel intimidated advocating to a representative or senator? Does that feel intimidating at all? Does it feel scary? It used to for me. I think it does for most people, even me still. I've done it for 20 years and I'll get a little nervous, and that's normal. And I ask that because if you feel that at all in any way, or you're working with people who might feel that way, nervous, scared, to remember that, and this is again, something that many of you might know, but it's a message you might convey to if you work with young people, if you work with others who want to engage in advocacy, I say this, that representatives and senators literally get paid to work for you. They are hired, they get paid to work for the people from their community. It's their job. It is literally their job to listen and understand what you want. Now they have to listen and understand what all of their constituents want and take that all together, but it's their job that they get paid to do. And so remembering that, and that taxpayer dollars go to that, and that there's lots of ways that people pay taxes, even if you're, you don't have, you might not even have a job at the moment, but there's lots of ways that through certain things that you buy, whether you have a license, there's lots of small ways that everybody contributes to the tax base. Okay, seems like the fall, important to get in when the earliest budget is being formed. Fair share, thank you, Leo. Love Fenway. Right, Fair Share Act. And so the truth of the matter is there's no wrong time to advocate. There's no totally wrong time. I mean, there is the summer session when no one's around, and that's not a great time. But in the fall is an important time that a lot of people, most advocates are a little slow getting it together in the fall. It takes some time to realize, okay, wow, we really need to there's an opportunity as early as the fall. But even if you don't have an ask together until the beginning of April, it's not too late. You can still work to create that change. And if you get connected to a larger advocacy agency that's trying to engage other people in advocacy, look out for their alerts, because they'll send something in April if there's an opportunity to advocate in the House budget. They might send something in May to advocate in the Senate budget. And it's valuable to advocate at all those steps. If you want something in the final conference committee budget, it has to at least be in the House or the Senate. So no totally wrong time. Okay, so I'm going to have you do one breakout activity before we close. You'll have 5 minutes. We're going to put, I think Claire's going to help me out and put a link to this sheet in the chat so you can pull it up before you go into your breakout groups. There'll be, 5 or 6 of you in a group, and I'm just going to, what I want you to do is agree on which of these policy advocacy actions you would choose as your top 2 most effective and why. And then if we have time, I'll look for, 1 or 2 groups to share out, if you're willing, on which 2 you chose and why. So I think we're good, Claire, if you don't mind sending folks into breakout, and we'll return at 11:51.
Okay, great. Doing it now.
Thank you. Can I have a volunteer who's willing to share what their group decided and why?
I can share a bit. A lot of our conversation focused more on those face-to-face interactions. So we talked quite a bit about in-person meetings with legislatures, as well as rallies at the State House, and not to discredit some of the other methods like the phone calls and the emails and the social media, because I think they can all be like important pieces of the puzzle. But I think it's easier for those to be kind of cast aside, whereas like a rally or an in-person meeting is like you're in somebody's face, so to speak. At the end, we also talked a little bit about kind of forming personal relationships, not only with like those at the top, but those, anyone who's working closely with certain representatives.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being willing to share, Andre. Can I have one other person from a different group?
Yeah, I'm happy to share. I mean, we talked a lot about the value of some in-person like legislative breakfasts and how that often can be very effective. Yeah, I think, putting faces to names and whatnot can help advance your advocacy.
Thank you, Zeus. I really appreciate both of you sharing what your groups talked about. And definitely one of the most important things is personal relationships. And again, putting humanity, like faces in front of policymakers and getting stories shared and creating that human connection. And so in-person meetings are the most effective way to advocate. It's just, that's not always possible, right? But in-person meetings, I've met with legislators where they'll tell me, I used to do it was called Teen Parent Lobby Day for many years at the State House, and it was one of the largest advocacy days at the Massachusetts State House. And I had a legislator who sponsored it for many years. And he said, you know what, I didn't have any experiential connection to young parenthood, but I met this one young woman from his district, was in Lynn, Mr. Senator McGee, who came to his office one year for Teen Parent Lobby Day and shared her story with him, and it forever changed him. A similar story, actually, I heard from who was a longtime leader on Beacon Hill, Senator Harriet Chandler from Worcester, who just retired this year. But similar to her, she was really impacted by a story from a young mom early in her career, and it really shaped things. And I'm sure we all have those personal experiences, right? Where either it's your own lived experience and you really understand something in a deep level, or you're really impacted by somebody else's and it sticks with you. And then the other thing I liked about what you all raised or lifted, both of you, Zeus and Andre, were ways to get lots of people in one place. So anytime, again, going back to as many people who can say the same message at the same time, it's kind of those two core pieces. How do you make it personal and humanized and impactful so people remember and care? And then how do you get as many people as possible conveying the same message in a way that will actually get to the person, or the legislators? And when it's, you can't ignore, it's hard to ignore a rally. It's hard to ignore legislative visits, or again, in person. But all of these obviously are effective to use in combination at different times, depending on the person. Emails also, I will just note before I turn to close, emails definitely matter. And it can take as little as 4 or 5 people from 4 or 5 people calling one representative's office on a particular issue with like the same ask for that representative to take note. More realistically, for their aide, who takes those calls and logs who calls about what, which they do, to take note and let their boss know. So you really can make a difference. And while I say getting as many people as possible to say the same message at the same time, when you take that down to the level of impacting, the rep and senator in your district, it doesn't take too much to begin to engage them and get them to pay attention to something. And I thank you, Joy, by the way, for putting the link earlier in the chat. Folks, you can see how to look up who your legislators are. That was really helpful. I appreciate that. Moving to close, I'd love you to enter into the chat just one thing that was surprising or motivating or interesting that you feel like you picked up or learned during this time we had together. It's always really helpful. And as you're doing that, which I will return back to see. Oh, someone asked, do you have any thoughts on question 6? Is there a lot of resistance from legislators on the Hill generally? Tell me what question 6 is. I may or may not be familiar with the issue.
Hi, yes, I'm oh, sorry, if you don't mind my
Yeah.
saying. It's the question about transparency in committees.
Oh, yes, that has a ton of is there a lot of resistance from legislators on the Hill generally? Yes, there is. But I think more from people at the top who are already hold the most power. And it is definitely complicated. We're almost at 12, and I welcome, please put other questions into the chat. I'll take them as I can this last minute. But I wanted to share just my contact information. I think Claire's going to put it in the chat and follow up with it too. A little more of the work that I do. I do other versions of this kind of training, but a lot of other things. I work in a variety of ways with nonprofits and philanthropic entities and government agencies, mostly nonprofits, on a range of things that in one way or another connect to public policy. So feel free to reach out with any questions at all. And I want to look for any other questions that come through here. Oh, great. I'm glad you like the socioeconomic model. Someone else said how to be intentional about tactics when you're working with finite resources. Thank you so much for your reflections, everybody. Really appreciate your time. And if any questions do come up or you want to reach out for any reason, feel free to do so. I'm available. Thank you so much, everyone. Claire, I'll hand it back over to you to close us.
Thanks, everyone. I'll be sending out the recording and a survey, my follow-up email, so just stay tuned for that, and hope to see you at another future MNN event. Have a great day, everyone.